Thank you very much. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm going to take you now from the northern hemisphere way down south to the southern hemisphere, as the depiction shows on the screen. I think it was interesting that Santosh chose to start off with a musical anecdote. I can just say I'm very pleased he chose not to sing it. Australia is an interesting pharmaceutical marketplace. It's a market that I think is dynamic, and although small by world standards, in many respects the legal issues that arise in Australia with respect to pharmaceuticals in a sense punch above their weight. We deal with issues that certainly are international in context, but we deal with them in a way which I think adds great credibility to the outcomes from our Australian judicial system that has to contend with these issues. And just to have a quick 2014 overview, it was, as I say here, really business as usual for pharmaceutical patent cases. We had one decision of the Australian High Court, which is our highest court of appeal. We had 4 from the full federal court, which is the equivalent, I suppose, of the US Federal Circuit, and 11 trial decisions. Now, those numbers may not seem particularly high, but for a population of 23 million people, less than the population of Mumbai, I think it's, as I say, punching above our weight. Those decisions dealt with a whole range of issues, as you would expect, from the patentability of isolated gene sequences, that is the Myriad decision, from patent term extension applications, which were allowed to be made 10 years out of time, to reconsideration of the inventive step test, and issues of contributory patent infringement. So I've chosen to take a couple of those issues to really concentrate on as showcasing, in a sense, some hot topic issues as they arise in Australia. So I'm going to deal with the approach that the Australian courts have taken to the issue of determining inventive step by reference to pharmaceutical cases, where the starting point for that consideration is an issue. And then secondly, I'll deal with the issue of contributory infringement of patent, a very controversial area in Australia, particularly where that relates to pharmaceutical indication carve-outs. So let's start off with inventive step. For standard patent applications where there was an examination request filed before the 15th of April 2013, and I'll interpolate there, the reason for that date is because we had a legislative change in that year with the so-called Raising the Bar Act, which changed our approach somewhat to inventive step. So a claimed invention will lack an inventive step if it is obvious in the light of either A, the common general knowledge, or common general knowledge considered together with information in a single document or through doing a single act, provided that if a document's relevant or in relation to the act, it could reasonably have been ascertained by the notional skilled addressee, understood by that addressee, and regarded as relevant to work in the art. Now, we refer commonly to that type of information in Australia as 7.3 information. That harks back to the relevant provision of the Australian Patents Act. So common general knowledge, or common general knowledge together with information that the notional skilled addressee could have ascertained, understood and regarded as relevant. So how do we get to this issue of starting point? Justice Jago in Apotex and AstraZeneca made the comment that in assessing obviousness, it's necessary to determine the nature of the claimed invention and the inventive step described in the patent. And I emphasise described in the patent. This may involve ascertaining the starting point of the inventive step, sometimes described in terms of an existing problem for which the inventor found a solution. So the common EPO problem solution approach. She went on to say the obviousness of the invention as claimed is then assessed by reference to the common general knowledge in Australia at the priority date. So this is the rosuvastatin case. And Justice Jago, who was the trial judge in that case, held that 3 AstraZeneca patents that were being asserted relating to formulations and uses of rosuvastatin, I hasten to add not the compound itself, were invalid and liable to be revoked after a validity challenge by Apotex, Watson and Ascent. Rosuvastatin is, of course, the very well-known blood cholesterol-lowering drug. And there were 3 patents in question. A so-called low-dose patent, which claims use of a 5 or 10 milligram dose of rosuvastatin, the HEFH patent, which claims a method of treating cholesterol by administering rosuvastatin, and the cation patent, which claims a formulation of rosuvastatin, including an inorganic salt. At first instance, the trial judge found that the patents at issue lacked inventive step, and she did that based on an earlier Australian full federal court decision in Apotex and Sanofi-Aventis. There was an appeal, but that appeal was really limited to the low-dose and cation patent only, and interestingly, the appellant sought a panel of 5 judges. Normally the full federal court sits as a panel of 3. The full bench of the full court of Australia is a 5-member bench, and that is pretty rare. It's really only in circumstances where there's considered to be an important legal issue that needs to be determined that a 5-member panel is convened, and this was such a case. So the key question on the appeal was, what is the appropriate starting point to assess whether a claimed invention involves an inventive step or is obvious? In Sanofi-Aventis, the earlier full court case, the full court had relied upon the description of the invention in the patent specification to determine where the starting point was for the test to be applied in relation to inventive step. And the full court here, in its full bench mode, was asked whether that was in fact the correct way of looking at starting point. So let's just deal with the low-dose patent and the way that the full federal court approached the matter. Claim 1 of that patent read a method of treating a patient suffering from hypercholesterolemia, which comprises administration as a starting dose of a single once-daily oral dose of 5 to 10 milligrams of the compound, which was rosuvastatin. So quite a simple claim in many respects. So, applying a problem-solution approach, what was the problem solved by the inventor in the case of the low-dose patent? That would be the normal approach taken. But that presents a difficulty, and the problem can be addressed in one of 3 potential ways. Is it possible to devise a new method for the treatment of high cholesterol? Is it possible to devise a new method for the treatment of high cholesterol using a statin? Is it possible to devise a new method for a treatment of high cholesterol using rosuvastatin? Now, each of those definitions, as is self-evident, really gives you a different starting point, but potentially also a different outcome in terms of whether or not the claimed dosage form and dosage regime was obvious. The trial judge addressed the question in the 3rd form. The starting point she held for devising the claimed dosage form was the use of rosuvastatin. In other words, that the notional skilled addressee would look at this patent assuming and knowing that rosuvastatin was administered for the treatment of hypercholesterolemia. Given that starting point, it was then relatively plain sailing for the judge to, based on the evidence of course, form the opinion that the development of the dosage regime was merely a matter of standard clinical trial practice, and she held that the low-dose form claims were invalid on the ground of lack of inventive step. The full court rejected that approach and re-emphasised that the comparison that has to be undertaken in Australia for determining inventive step is a comparison between the invention as claimed and the common general knowledge, either the common general knowledge alone or the common general knowledge as enhanced by the Section 7.3 information that I referred to earlier. And the full court said The relevant provisions of the Patents Act do not expressly or impliedly contemplate that the body of knowledge and information against which the question whether or not an invention, so far as claimed, involves an inventive step, is to be determined based on simply an assessment of what the patentee in the patent specification says is the problem that ought to be solved and was solved by the claimed invention. That isn't the approach that's appropriate, the court said. Remember, we're talking here in relation to a dosage regime patent, not the compound patent. The question implicitly posed by the Patents Act, said the court, is not given rosuvastatin would the administration of it at the claimed doses be obvious, but rather the question is, given a patient suffering from hypercholesterolemia, would the treatment of that patient with rosuvastatin at the claimed doses be obvious? Now, you might think that the outcome is going to be, well, given that starting point, then the claims ought to be held valid and non-obvious. However, that wasn't the outcome. Here, the notional skilled addressee was held when armed only with the common general knowledge, which of course is established by evidence, and the fact that here there were disclosures in 2 prior art documents. The notional skilled addressee would in fact have been led as a matter of course to experiment with the dosage regime in the expectation that doing so might well lead to a useful or better alternative of dosage regime to that which went before. So that was an obvious to try approach that was taken by the court, and given the evidence and what would have been known to the notional skilled addressee, again, those claims were held to be lacking in validity on the ground of lack of inventive step. And one can perhaps compare that approach with the relatively recent US Supreme Court decision in KSR and Teleflex, where the US Supreme Court really took a quite similar approach to a determination of the approach to inventive step in the United States, where one looks at matters external to the patent specification to determine inventive step, not what the patentee considered to be inventive. So let's go on to indication carve-outs. I should be able to deal with this topic within time. This case relates to the substance pregabalin and to Pfizer's Lyrica product that has pregabalin as its active ingredient. This is quite an important decision, and I think it's important for both originators and generic companies. The Lyrica patent in Australia covers a pain indication, and Lyrica itself has been used for indications of other matters, and those indications had patent protection but subsequently expired, and they were essentially epilepsy indications. In February of 2014, Apotex notified Pfizer that it was about to launch a pregabalin product, but for the treatment of epileptic seizures, not for the treatment of pain. The pain indication was still the subject of a Pfizer-owned patent. Pfizer decided that that wasn't good enough and chose to commence proceedings seeking a preliminary injunction against Apotex to prevent it from launching into the Australian marketplace its pregabalin product, regardless of what the indicated use for Apotex's product was. And this brought into play the rather notorious section of the Australian Patents Act that deals with contributory infringement, section 1172B. That prohibits the supply of an unauthorised product to a person if the supplier had reason to believe that the person to whom the product is being supplied would put it to an infringing use. At first instance, on the preliminary injunction application, Justice Griffiths noted that Apotex also intended to provide letters to medical practitioners and to pharmacists, informing them that the Apotex products are not indicated for the treatment of neuropathic pain, when prescribing the Apotex products for the treatment of seizure disorders, that indication should be shown on the prescription, and if the prescription doesn't specify that the pregabalin which has been prescribed for an epileptic seizure indication, then they should not offer the Apotex product to the patient. And Justice Griffiths, based on that evidence, held that Apotex could have no reason to believe in those circumstances that the products would be put to an infringing use, and refused to grant a preliminary injunction. The full court overturned that decision and held that Apotex, by proposing to supply its product, notwithstanding that there was a carved out indication,